She's almost maybe she'll move to Portland. They say.
Track chasing it.
Yes, I thought the 1940 Saturday. Fluke, somebody notified me because got up there to plane. You know, it turned 2 years. Special.
Andy, do you want to talk at the beginning or do you just want to stay there? I might just introduce you and you can stand up and wave, you know, like a Rose Bowl wave, like a queen, a princess.
Different.
Yeah.
Got scored. But it was definitely a software problem. You know, online is they out of running and they are. Yeah, a lot of them.
Firefox, one of the ways you get a loop of 5 until see the audio, keep looping. No, we don't want that.
People stay on.
All right, we're live on YouTube, so we're ready.
All right, I think we need to start this show because the folks out there in Zoom land, they want to watch too. So. Welcome to the March 2024 Rocky Mountain Railroad Club meeting. I'm Dave Schaaf, the Beep, and Andy's going to stand up and wave. He's our current president. Yeah. Speaking of that, we do need some people to step up to the board next year. If anybody wants to start thinking about it now before we start rolling in. Do we have anybody on this side of the room that is new or hasn't been here? It's our chance to do intros. Anybody over here? You've been here before?
About 10 years ago.
Stand up and tell us who you are. We're glad to see you back.
We don't get the church. I'll talk.
Okay.
I don't know. My cousin here, Kirk. Come on. Okay.
Kurt Coates' cousin here. Tell us your name. Mike.
Yeah.
All right. Well, glad you got to come back. All right. Current affair. Chip, come on. Tell us something.
Hey, over at the Denver Rock Island for the last 10 years or so, there's been a dome coach that was gutted by our railcar years ago. Anyways, the original number was Union Pacific 7000, used built by American Car Foundry back in December 1954. Publicity shots you might have seen if you were around in the 1950s. They were real proud of it. Needless to say, it's been repainted primer gray. And it's finally moved off the Denver Rock Island. It's currently sitting at North Yard, expecting to go to North Platte soon. Stay tuned. And then, what was that one? Oh,
Veterans Youth.
yes, Union Pacific 1943 showed up on a 94 car oil can train out of Wellington, Utah this weekend. Came through the freshly fallen snow around the Tunnel District and moved out to St. James, Louisiana. So it was nice to see it. Such gorgeous light. But 1943 is the veterans, yeah. 42 troops. Thank you.
Well done. Okay, last Thursday, there was a special train between Denver and Longmont. They used the train set that typically runs on the Amtrak Winter Park Express. You know, because as most of us around here know, they've been talking about trying to have some sort of rail service between here and Longmont or even Fort Collins. So last Thursday, they ran a train with the governor and the president of Amtrak and some other movers and shakers and whatnot to, I guess, see what it's like and hopefully see what they can do about moving this project along. I know it's been way behind schedule. So that was interesting to see a passenger train go up the Front Range Sub on the BNSF. Chip was there and I was there. Cast of thousands. And even Joe McMillan was there.
Ooh.
Is that why the light was so crappy then? It was pretty darn gray and it was right on the edge of snow. And I even brought pictures to it, or was gonna bring pictures and probably left them in my computer tonight. So there we are. I guess if you look at Facebook, I'll put them on the club's Facebook page one of these days. That was kind of big news. Also today, the East Broad Top back in narrow gauge back in Pennsylvania, quiet now. Back in Pennsylvania, they announced that they're going to expand farther out than they have done since about 1956. I guess their fundraising is going well. They've got a good crew. They're clearing the brush and spiffing up the track. You know, seems like good things are happening there. I'd like to go back and see it myself. How many people here have been to East Broad Top in the last couple of years? Joe. Joe's here, and John Charles is here. We haven't seen him in a while either. And Bernie Watts. Bernie said he might let us have a tour up there one of these days. Well, I'll keep bugging him. So stay tuned. We haven't had a tour of any facilities in a while, so maybe we can twist Bernie's arm. I don't know, buy a box of donuts or something like that. It's all about bribery.
Donuts and freeway.
Or maybe good coffee.
Or beer, that's
The Como Roundhouse folks, I think they're planning on having houses on third Saturdays of months coming up. I'm not talking about the annual Boreas Pass Railroad Day, but third Saturdays. Do we know which month that might start?
I think they're saying June.
June and July. Don't go up there. Don't go up there in March and April. We're not ready for it yet.
September.
They told me that people have showed up in November on the third Saturday. If everybody would put your cell phones on silent or stun or something like that, then it's less embarrassing. And coming up on April the 9th, our next meeting, our program will be Cooperson Toltec Scenic Railroad pictures from 40 years ago. Earl Loeb is going to show us that stuff via Zoom from Arizona because we couldn't afford to fly him up here. And then mark your calendars for the 19th of May. That's when we're going to have our annual club picnic out of the Railroad Museum. I think they'll have one, maybe even two steam engines hot that weekend. And we'll have our same good barbecue caterer. We don't have a price yet, but I would think it'd probably be within $2 or $3 of what it was last year. He really does try to help us keep the cost down. So, if there's no other announcements, I'll bring up Bill Jones. Oh, Kurt, you got something you want to say? Shall I bring you a microphone? Oh, okay, speak loudly.
Brought in my consolidations.
More donations on the back table. We want to give stuff away.
It's not a donation.
No. Well, tell us what it is then. It's something you wanted to show people?
Oh, you can walk over. The history of it, I'm thinking maybe the 50s. It's very old.
Is it a something that hangs on the wall? Or yeah, my eyes are pretty graphic, so I was looking for a description.
Runs on track. I believe it's going.
So that's a model railroad thing. Bill Jones, I think it's on. Well, yeah. It's for you. Go ahead.
Okay, so have you ever wondered how these locomotives that were built in 1881, 82, back in the day, how did they manage to keep these things running for 70 years? Now, of course, we know why they used them. They used branch lines with light rail and things like that. But of course, then you had the Great Grand Southern, which was all light rail. But let's go dive a little deeper into the technical things and look at some of the politics and things that were going on. This little brown book here is actually one of the key reasons that all these locomotives made it into the late 20th century. And we'll talk about what this little book is. And we'll also give a little tip of the hat to a not so famous, but well-known William Howard Taft. And what was his role in helping to preserve not just the narrow gauge, but a lot of old steam locomotives? So we'll go, I've got to sit back here
That's fine.
around the show. Okay, so is this gonna, are we on slideshow mode?
I think so.
Yeah, okay, let's just see if it. We want it to. Normally it just, yeah, okay. All right, well, we saw the front page.
Yeah, I guess paragraph work buttons and mouse don't seem to be doing it.
All right. So we have a collection of photographs here. It's going to be kind of a photo essay. And the photographers that we're going to show tonight, of course, William Henry Jackson, R.B. Collins, famous Fred Jukes, a little bit from Baldwin, Otto Perry, Richard Kindig, Laurie Brown, Mac Poor, Donald E.A. Rogers, Bob Richardson, Monte Ballou, John Stivers, Clyde Travis with Backshop Enterprises, plug there, Vernon, and Bob Lemessina. And of course, in order to get all photographs from all these guys, you have to have the collectors. And the collectors, of course, these mostly came from my grandfather, Morris Abbott. And he got them from other collectors. You know, back in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, the guys that were interested in narrow gauge and steam, you know, you didn't have Facebook and email and all this other stuff to share photos. You made copy photos and mailed them to your friends, who then put them in file folders and kept them forever. A lot of these photographs, some of the interesting ones, came from a fellow named William Bissinger. He lived in New York State. I don't know anything about him, never heard of his name before or in print, but we've got some very interesting photographs from him. Del Gerbas, of course, he was a club member, lived in Wolf Creek. Mal Farrell, the late Mal Farrell, collected some of these. Charlie Ryland here, Vaughn Jones of Silverton, George Siddick was another Eastern collector, H.B. Parker from Lincoln, Nebraska, and of course, Colorado Railroad Museum. So let's see if we make this thing advance. And we're gonna have to do it this way, I guess. No, it's not technically working here. Well, it's not doing it. Okay.
Is that where you want to be?
All right. So of course we do research for this sort of thing. Baldwin Locomotives, Illustrated Catalog, 1872. Steam in the Rockies, which was one of the first rosters done of the Rio Grande by Bob Richardson and Cornelius Hauck. Dirk Ramsey and George Lawrence did the book on 346. George Niederauer did a very in-depth book on the 315, which has a lot of good information. And then, of course, your pictorials. And then we get into the Interstate Commerce Commission. That's what the little brown book is. Locomotive inspection laws, rules for testing, revised and came out in 1911, was revised in 1915 to cover all parts of the locomotive and tender. And then 1924 and other advances, some of the safety standards, and then, of course, official rosters from the Rio Grande. So, there is. Does it work with the key? All right, we'll use the key. So, in the beginning, where did the locomotives come from? Baldwin Locomotive Works. Here's an engraving from their 1872 catalog in Philadelphia. Took up several city blocks. And the Denver and Rio Grande, the little baby railroad, started out with very light locomotives. Here's the Montezuma 240, 25,000 pounds. Very beautiful little guy. That was for passengers, trains, and then, of course, the larger 260s for the freight trains. Later, they upped these a little bigger to about 40,000 pounds, and this was one of the mainstays for freight in the early days. And then they also brought in the standard American class, which topped out at 42,000 pounds, the heaviest engines before the consolidations came in. And there's a shot of a 440 locomotive with a two-car photographer's special for William Henry Jackson, 1882-83 over there on the Cumbres line. Just pulling two cars, that's about all it could handle, so not real helpful for the large-scale expansions. 1873, map of the Denver and Rio Grande. We see that the line has been built down to Pueblo and extended as far as Canyon City. Now, the initial plan, of course, was to go to El Paso, Texas over Raton Pass. Santa Fe beat the Rio Grande out to build their line, and but they still wanted to go south. So the new line for the Rio Grande was going to go over Veda Pass. And I didn't copy the lower part of this map. It's very long, but it actually shows a projected line all the way to Santa Fe and down into the Mexican border at El Paso. So they had big plans, but this changed their motive power needs because now they had to go over on 4% grades. And you see in 1873, there's no San Juan extension, there's no Gunnison extension. And in fact, Leadville is still marked as Oro City. So they went back to Baldwin and they said, we need heavier motive power. And in 1866, Baldwin had come out with a new design called the Consolidation. It was built for the Lehigh Valley for a steep 2.5% grade that they had back there. And because Lehigh Valley was just consolidated some other smaller lines, they called the locomotive consolidation. This is not that engine. This is not a Rio Grande engine, but it is an 1872 locomotive at Baldwin. Now, the trick that made this locomotive successful, the first one, there was no flanges on the front two drivers. And in this photograph, it's hard to see, but in fact, there is no flange on the front driver of this locomotive. And that's how they got around having such a long wheelbase. And of course, we know the narrow gauge locomotives were blind or flangeless in the center two drivers. So the Rio Grande they built the first consolidation for the Rio Grande in 1873. It was called the Mosca. And it's unclear if that was actually delivered or not. The problem was it was way too heavy, somewhere around 75 or 80,000 pounds. This locomotive here is 90,000 pounds. Well, a locomotive that heavy wasn't going to make it on the light Rio Grande track, and the locomotive was actually sold to the East Broad Top instead. Okay, it's not moving. So the first consolidation that was actually delivered and operated to the Rio Grande was the number 22 Alamosa. It was built in 1877 and was renumbered 228 in 1894. Seen here on the Calumet branch, which was an iron ore mine spur out of Salida. And this engine weighed 59,000 pounds. So technically it was carried on the books with a Class C60. And this was built before the smaller Class 56 engines came a few years later. They actually built 3 locomotives of this type. They're distinguished by having a wagon top boiler. It's a little hard to see in this photograph, but you know, where the boiler shell expanded there under the steam dome, larger diameter. So for whatever reason, they probably used this as a test engine when they finally got to build the large order of Class 56. The classic engine here, they did not have wagon top boilers, and they were a little bit lighter, probably as a result. Here's a never before published photograph of Huerco, number 81, built in 1880, and it's in Durango in the fall of 1881, shortly after the rails got there. I mean, there hasn't even been time for weeds to grow along the right-of-way there. Look at all the ties stacked there for the Silverton extension. The boys are up there at Rockwood blasting, and a few shacks there for the start of Durango. So a beautiful photograph by R.B. Collins, who was a Durango photographer very early on. We're still having technical problems here. So the Class 56 engines were what was built in the 1870s and up into 1880. The last locomotive of the class was 83. Here on the left, Sarah LaSalle was actually built out of sequence. If you look at its builder's numbers and other locomotives delivered, it was built late in 1881. They were already starting to build the C60s at that time. This shown here on the Silverton branch with kind of a homemade snowplow of some sort there with looks like an avalanche path in the back. And below the well-known Jackson photograph of the 440 Kokomo and one of the Class 56 engines taken 1880, 1881. So here we have a photograph from the William Bissinger collection, and it's a pretty rare one. I've never seen it anywhere. This is what a Grande locomotive looked like brand new from the factory. This is the 225. It was built in 1882. The photograph has some original retouching where they've shaded out the background, but we've brought some of that in with the magic of digital, and does look to be in the rail yard, probably here in Denver. It's sitting on a turntable. And there's a lot of interesting things about this locomotive. The smokestack is somewhat unusual, smaller smoke box door. Let's take a little closer. A little close up here. If you look real closely on the steam chest, you actually see the name Grande, either engraved or probably raised lettering on the wrapper around the steam chest. Those certainly didn't last very long. And you can also see a rather interesting lubrication where we have a static lubricator with the reservoir on the valve chest. And then the hydrostatic line comes through into a T there, which brings in extra oil. We're going to see those on the Baldwins too, very early, kind of unusual. Not sure what they were trying to achieve there. Maybe if the hydrostatic didn't work, they could convert to the other or something like that. Don't have any idea really. So Grant got the first batch of 28 locomotives, and then Baldwin got the larger batch of the C60s. Now these are back to 59,000-pound locomotives, like that early one. And here's the helper station in the early 1880s at Cimarron. Even though these engines were all practically brand new, you do see some differences. Headlights are a little different. We do see that the Baldwin also has the static lubricator as well as the hydrostatic feed line going to the valve chest there. Another shot that's never been reproduced is this one of the 262 as a helper on a passenger train on the westbound leg of the Y at Cimarron. Cimarron was a little tight in that the river transected the railroad, comes out of the canyon on our left. You can just see the curve. It crosses the Cimarron River and curves around to the left there. That would be the main line heading up Cerro Summit. And the Y went back along the river and then had to have another bridge to get across to tie back into the main line. So this westbound train has apparently backed into the Y for the photographer. This was published in 1889 in a very high-end, what you might call a coffee table book by the photogravure process. So it's remarkably detailed for being a reproduction. Another Jackson photograph that's everybody's probably seen, the locomotive 278 in its early years at the Smith Hill anthracite mine. And we have a nice side view of what the Baldwins look like with the panels on the cab and 6-inch air pumps and a nice little short caboose there. And of course, 278 will show up later as it's one of the few survivors of the collapse. And of course, in the 1890s, a lot of locomotives were sold to the Rio Grande Southern, and the other Otto Mears railroads, Silverton Railroad, Silverton, Gladstone, Northerly, and you can see still not too much changes here. Headlights a little different, and a nice, interesting paint job on the 21 here. And as we said, as the lines got extended through the mountains, and Marshall Pass in particular, with its long miles and miles of 4% grade, we're still going to need heavier locomotives for it. This is about a 28-car train. It's Class C60s. That's pushing up probably out of Mears Junction there, heading west. And so Baldwin brought out and built some larger locomotives, Class 70s. We're going to mainly focus on the 400 to 411. These 12 were built in 1881. There's a little bit of confusion on some of these. Now, this photograph is actually of a locomotive number 414. Now, on the back of the photograph, another Bissinger collection seems to indicate it's a narrow gauge locomotive. It's a Class 70. It's built in 1881. We've got the dual lubricators on the steam chest. And, but according to the rosters, this was a standard gauge locomotive that was built in 1881. I'm not sure if one's wrong or one's right, but it's a nice picture, so we're going to show it anyway. So now by 1881, 1882, we've got the three main classes of locomotives built. And here's some statistics. Now, these would be the as-built, as best as I can tell from various sources. Class 56, the first one, fairly low boiler pressure, 130 pounds, 56,000 pounds of weight on the drivers, tractive force of 13,000. Class 60, or later called C16, a little higher boiler pressure, 145, a little bigger cylinders, a little heavier weight, and heavier tractive effort. And the Class 70s, these were going to be the heavy helper locomotives, again, 145 pounds, bigger cylinders, more weight, and 15,000 tractive pounds. So these are the three classes that we'll be looking at. And so just to kind of tally up where we're at here by 1880, we just had the three, what we call the first Baldwin C60s, and then the 53, the Class 56, with a total of 56 locomotives. And then by 1882, we've got the big order from Grande and Baldwin, and then the heavier locomotives for 152 locomotives in 1882. We'll kind of track this as we go. And after a few years, railroad safety laws started to affect the locomotives and how they looked and how they were operated. And the first rule was the 1893 Railroad Safety Appliance Act. And this required automatic couplers and automatic air brakes. But there was initially a 7-year grace period. 1900 is when all the main lines were supposed to be done. The Rio Grande narrow gauge didn't have to comply until 1903. And whether that was everybody or just the narrow gauge, I'm not sure. But 1903 was the year that everything really got converted or finished being converted. And this is a classic Fred Jukes photo of the 404. This is a scan of an original print that Fred Jukes sent to my grandfather in the 1950s. So pretty sharp. It's usually attributed to sergeants, the helper station at the base of Marshall Pass, but later work when Mal Farrell did a article on Fred Jukes, it's pretty well known that it's at Cedar Creek, which was the west base of Cirro Summit. And you can tell that from, I've cropped out some of the features that you could tell that from. So that was 1902. That was before Fred worked for the railroad. He was just traveling through. But here we have the 1904 picture by mining engineer Warren Prosser. Not real good quality. I've shown this before, but we can see if you look real close, that's a knuckle coupler, a slotted knuckle on the front of the locomotive. And the other reason that we know 1903 was the year that they really had to have automatic air and knuckle couplers was because of the boxcars that you can see behind the locomotives there. Those are the 3000 series boxcars. They were delivered in 1903, and they had automatic air and knuckle couplers, along with a number of other cars that were bought that year. Front locomotive is a Grant product. We can see the distinctive sand dome and then a bald one behind. So by 1904, we're starting to see some changes, radical changes here. Of course, the smaller class 56 engines have dropped quite a few off the roster. They've been retired, sold. Still have a couple of the early C60s. We've got the 28 Grants, but now notice the bald ones dropped from 56 units to 23 units on the C60s. Most of those having been sold to roads like the Rio Grande Southern and some of the other smaller short lines. And then a couple of the C19s have been sold to the RGS. So they're dropped down to 10 for a total of 96 units still on the roster. So after the rebuildings there in that early period, the locomotives looked like this. And here's the classic Fred Jukes photo you've all seen with a class C17 on the front, the 419. Now, those were built in 1887. I'm not technically going to follow their development, but it's pretty similar. Then we've got a C16 or C60 behind it and something coming up on the rear. And I'm sorry, a class 7411 behind. Again, another beautiful original print from Fred Jukes, and fabulous ability to get action shots that early with the slow films. Another photographer who was around that time was Monte Ballou, and he worked for the railroad. And this is a shot that came from the Charlie Ryland collection. And you can see it's actually a glass plate that's been cracked when this print was, at the time this print was made, and pushing rotary OM up Compass Pass. Beautiful photo there. So things stayed about the same until finally 1910 came. And now this was historically the era of the progressivism, where the government became more active to try to right the wrongs of health and safety and other things. And Theodore Roosevelt championed, and then his successor, William Howard Taft, known as Big Bill. Of course, he weighed about 300 pounds, so he really was big. Ironically, interesting, he's the only president, at least that I know of, who actually rode the Rio Grande narrow gauge. In 1909, when they opened the Gunnison Tunnel in Montrose, he rode behind the 168, a little short train with the business cars, up to Cedar Creek, where the tunnel portal was, a little short narrow gauge front. But anyway, in the State of the Union address in 1910, he states that protection of railroad employees is a subject of the highest importance, demands continuing attention, and he specifically said with respect to boilers, a law should be drawn up requiring enforcement and penalties, a proper system of inspection. Because at this time, while some states may have had inspection, there was no national standard for the railroads system. And so Congress got together with the railroad industry, although the railroad industry was totally against the law. They did work with the Master Mechanics Association. They did send out questionnaires to a couple thousand different railroad master mechanics, and they developed what is known as the Boiler Inspection Act of 1911. And now a lot of things changed with this act, and a lot of it's familiar to people even running steam today. Of course, safety factors on boilers were increased from 3 to 4. Now that was phased in over a number of years, but it meant that boiler pressures might have to be reduced if you couldn't meet all the specs. But the biggest thing was the infamous ICC Form 4. Yes, that's the same Form 4 that the Federal Railroad Administration has today for any steam locomotive in interstate service or a mainline service. It required engineering calculations to be submitted for all boilers to determine safe working pressure by 1912. And one of the things they did was that this is where older boilers started to have restrictions put on. If you didn't know what the strength of your steel was by testing from the manufacturer, you had to assume 50,000 pounds for steel and 45,000 pounds for wrought iron. Now, some places you'll read that the 1911 Act outlawed wrought iron boilers. And since some of these early Rio Grande engines had wrought iron boilers, that's why they had to get new boilers. Well, it didn't really actually outlaw wrought iron boilers, and it didn't actually outlaw lap seam boilers. But what it did was that when you factor in the safety factors and the lower tensile strength, and particularly on the lap seam, the lower strength of the joints, basically your old boilers weren't going to be able to pull anything because you were going to have to cut the operating working pressure down so much. Many other things were changed. The other big thing in 1915, the Inspection Act was expanded to cover everything on a locomotive and tender. And I mean everything. And the amount of detail in some of these rules is almost unbelievable. So we've got complete changes of water glass, ash pans, safety shields, cab lights, air compressors had to be tested. There was actually a rule that in certain states, such as Colorado and the other mountain states, and even in California, north of an imaginary line from Sacramento to Reno, everything a locomotive above that line had to have enclosed cabs, clear vision windows, which had an unhinged opening, and special curtains, which were detailed of how big the curtains were, and of course, all the safety appliances standards for handrails, both on cars and on locomotives. 1915 was the rule for headlights that required 800-foot visual distance, and this is when we start seeing the electric headlights come in. Initially carbon arc, and then later they changed the incandescent. The reason they didn't have incandescent headlights initially in 1915 is that the tungsten bulbs that were needed to withstand that didn't really come out commercially until around 1916. So it appears that there was a pretty quick changeover from arc to incandescent. And then other additions were done, and one of the interesting ones, 1929, automatic fire doors operated by foot pedals. So we had those installed on the old engines, and of course the newer ones already had it. So what was the response from the Rio Grande? Well, in 1912, they were pretty hard up for money since all their money went to build the Western Pacific. And, this was when they got the nickname Dangerous and Rapid. Dangerous and, rapidly growing worse and that sort of thing. So they selected a number of the Class 60 and 70 locomotives for rebuilding. But the class 56, man, they're gone. And now by this year, boiler steel was running at about 65,000 PSI strength on boilers. So you could build a modern boiler at 160 PSI working pressure. And you can't get too much bigger because of the slide valves. But this increased the tractive force of the class 60 to 16,000 pounds and increased the tractive force of the class 70 to 19,000 pounds. And so that's where, of course, later we get the class C16 and the class C19. Now, one of the other things that happened was that the cabs were completely rebuilt. They got rid of the cabs that were made out of ash and walnut by Baldwin, put oak cabs on. They put in required storm windows. You'll see snifters, pressure relief valves on the steam chest added at this time. All the cab appliances were new with, safety glass on the water glasses, things like that, newer safety valves, larger 9.5-inch air pumps, sometimes dual air pumps. We've got automatic brakes now, pile type E turbo generators, as we said initially with arc headlights. Many of the engines got larger tender tanks, and then the wooden pilots started getting changed out with steel tube pilots. So you can see from this list that when you look at a locomotive like the 346 or the 268 on display, what you're really looking at is mostly an engine that was built in the teens. And of course, it took a few years to get all these locomotives rebuilt. Now, I've got this photograph here because it's one of the only ones I've ever seen that shows what an original 1880s boiler looks like. You can see this is the boiler off of the class 60 number 283 that was put on to Silverton Railroad number 100. And this shot around 1920 on the deadline in Silverton, Colorado. And what this tells us, you see the double row of rivets on the longitudinal. That's got to be a lap sink boiler. And that does not look like a modern boiler. And that right there, whether that boiler is made out of iron or whether it's made out of steel, it really doesn't matter, because without that type of construction and bracing, it is not going to meet the modern 1911 boiler law without reducing the pressure to the point where it's really not useful. So let's compare it to the 1916 era boiler. And here is the 278 in 1975, when I had the pleasure of contracting with the National Park Service with a couple of my friends from Western State College, and we did the first initial preservation, cosmetic restoration work on the locomotive while it stood on the bridge. This is before OSHA, by the way. Thank goodness. Also before a certain substance that used to surround that boiler was regulated, which was also good. And but you can clearly see the jointing there to the left of the front air pump. You'll see there's 4 rows of rivets and what they call a welt strip. So this boiler has the sheets have been drawn together, and then the seam has got a plate on the inside, the welt plate on the outside, and then these big heavy rivets. And so that is the more modern type of boiler. Now, some locomotives, just as an aside, the Florence and Cripple Creek engines built in the 1890s, Rio Grande was able to beef up the bracing on those boilers. They didn't have to get rebuilt during this time, but the older engines definitely did. And one of the things that happens when you up the boiler pressure is you get more torque, horsepower, and there's some video out there of the poor 278 and the 268 on the Baldwin branch with maximum tonnage starting up, and those engines are rocking from side to side so hard that the spring hangers are bashing into the boilers. And this has a patch on the back hanger, but here you can see on the front hanger on the left side, they actually had to cut out the boiler metal and rivet a heavy patch in. And all of those little boilers have this kind of damage from what I've seen. So what else happened in the rebuild? Well, we changed the smokestack. Rio Grande had two different designs. Don't know why some was used on some locomotives, but here's the a tracing of their design. And then you can see the door, the 223 there, that's got the clear vision windows, the little opening flap there at the top. Also a statement about flange oilers. Now this photograph was published by Mal Farrell back in his Rio Grande Southern book. And in the book, it states that this is the Ridgeway Roundhouse crew with a showing off the first electric headlight on the RGS. And that may well be true. But the print copy that I have, which also both of these came from Del Gurbas, had annotations on it that this was the first straight shot stack on the RGS. In other words, the first locomotive with the new boiler with the straight stack and of course the electric headlight. And if you really look at this engine, you realize that it's a pretty complete rebuild. Look at the cab. That's not a Baldwin cab from 1882. That is a new cab. You can still see the shine on the varnish there. The paneling's different. This is the type of cab that's still on some of these engines today. So now we enter into the World War I period, 1917, and no more Class 56. They're gone, and still got a couple of the old Baldwins, but still got 28 Grants and 23 of the others, so not too much change. The interesting thing I always thought that this shows is how they kept these Grant locomotives for a long time, and they were getting rid of the Baldwins right and left. Now, I don't know if that tells us anything, but I just thought it's interesting. Finally, we get to the 1920s, and we start having the rail fan community coming out, mainly out of Perry at this time. And here's the 204 in a well-known shot at Chama. And look at all the changes now. We've got the bigger 9.5-inch air pump. That's definitely an E6 pile generator there. We've got the big boxy headlight with the truncated little vent on the top. It's probably an electric arc headlight to start with, but it's got incandescent in it now. And so it's they're starting to show their age. Got the pilot made out of steel, piping, and that sort of thing. Here's another shot of the another Grant locomotive, 211, the switcher in Salida. Salida was a 3-rail dual gauge yard, so it's got the dual gauge couplers and dual air pumps that most of them had. Again, you can see the old arc headlight, but it's got a glass facing in it. You can see inside that's definitely incandescent. Some of the photographs you'll see in the arc headlight era, you'll see that headlight glass frosted or even white because, of course, those arc lights were very bad to look at, like welding, electric welding. So by 1923, we've got the nice roster that the Colorado Railroad Museum reprinted, and we've still got all 28 of the Grants, and we've still got the 23. So nothing really changed from 1917 to 1923, but it's going to start changing very rapidly in the 1920s with the addition of all the big, heavy new motive power. Going back to the good old 278, here's a postcard shot taken in 1920 in Sapanero. The 278 was used as the Lake City branch engine out of Gunnison. And with one coach, that's engineer Pete Reddy, who was a longtime engineer there. And we still see the large E-type turbo generator. Interesting, has a muffler on it, and the square headlight and so forth. But by 1930, they're really starting to get rid of these little engines. Still got one of those early Baldwins hanging in there. Now we've dropped off over half the Grants and Baldwin down to 8. But the C19s, they're heavier power. They're hanging in there pretty good. So we're down now to cut over in half in just a few years. Our thing is stuck again. All right, so 278 pretty much spent its life in Gunnison. Here we see it coming back from shopping, probably in Salida. Here in this photograph in Gunnison, Donald E.A. Rogers worked for the railroad. He was their water inspector, water tank inspector, and shot some very nice photographs. And this one shows interesting color scheme. We've got the gray graphite on the smoke box. It's actually a green boiler jacket. Hard to tell black and white, but if you look at enough of these, you can kind of tell. And then, but the biggest change is the tender tank. Now, these large straight-sided tanks were added to locomotives as needed. There's quite a few C16s got them, and other locomotive classes got them. But take a look at that lettering there. Does it look somewhat funny? Anything funny about that lettering? How it sits on the side of that tender? We'll come back to that here in a bit. And 278, again in Gunnison in 1940 now. Richard Kindig, beautiful shot. This is the picture we used as the prototype for the restoration work at the National Park Service and at Cimarron. We see that the turbo generator's been changed to the more modern type. What type is that again? K240. K240, that's right. And headlights now been changed, and now we see the still with the tank and the Moffat Tunnel Rio Grande Herald. So a workaday engine running up to Baldwin to get those coal cars. So I talked about something funny about the lettering. Let's take a look at this a little closer. So here on the left is the 1935 shot. Look at the position of the D in Denver, the N Western. Now look at the 1940 shot. You see they're shifted. What's the deal here? Well, the color shot, that's 1975. We sanded down the tender sides, and when we did, we found two sets of lettering that were offset by about 8 or 9 inches. And what this is telling us is that this tender had on the right, or on the left rather, that tender used to be longer, came off another locomotive. And how do we know this? Well, when we got back to the back head of the tender and started sanding away in the 70s, look what appeared underneath the numeral 7. You've got a 6 showing up. And you can see there's 2 versions of 2s, there's 2 versions of 7, there's 2 alignments of 8, but then you got this 6 right in the middle. 6, well, what locomotive did this tender come from? For a long time, I thought it was maybe a K27, but none of them were scrapped in 35. So, but we find very interestingly that T12 locomotives, the 166 and 167, were scrapped in November of 1934, and in the spring of 1935, there is a new tender on the 278. And the T12 tenders were just a little bit longer. The frames were a little longer. And so they cut the rivet lines on the back, shortened up the back head, and riveted back together. And that's where the 278's tender came from, we think. I haven't gotten photographs of those engines to compare. But here we have again, a little workhorse, 1947 Mac 4. Shot this, see some of the old lettering peeling off under the paint job there, but now we've got the flying Grande. And we've got a little bigger sand dome. They've raised that up. So this is pretty much, you know, as it looked when it was retired in the 50s. And as I said, we did preservation work on it in 1975. This was how it came out. This was before drones now, folks. I had to climb up the side of the canyon there to get this shot. But beautiful display, but very hard to maintain the equipment. But it's back on the display now. The locomotive had been pulled off around 2008 or 9, and there was a contract to do more work on it, redo it in 2010, which I tried to bid on, but I was not the low bidder. And you know what you get when you go with the low bidder. We'll see that later. So what about the other older preserved engines? Well, 223, of course, is the only Grande locomotive surviving. And good old William Bissinger, don't know where he finds these things, but here's a photograph of the 223 in the 1890s. We still see the big pointy pilot there, but the domes have already been changed out. We don't have Grande domes on it anymore. Those domes do match the later photographs. I have tried every trick in the photography book to try to read a number on that locomotive, but the back of the photo says 220, 223, and so we're going to go with that. And from what we can tell, it does seem to match. Of course, this is the older boiler. And 223 in the modern era, out of Perry again, 1940, just before it was donated to the city of Salt Lake City. And we see 223, one of the workhorses of the Baldwin branch out of Gunnison. By 1940, it's getting pretty thin out there for the small guys. We've only got the one Grande left, 223, and it's going to leave pretty quick. We got two of the C16s, the 268, 278. We still got 4 of the C19s. We're not including the RGS on this list. So we got 7 locomotives. So what about 268? Well, it knocked around a lot. It was the switch engine in the 30s in Durango. Richard Kindig took this shot. Gerald Best took another similar one. And again, pretty much you see the E-type generator. You've got the muffler, a little bit of homemade cinder catcher there, the original tender or the old style tender. And so it was just another workaday small engine there in Durango. But after the 223 was donated, 268 moved up to the Gunnison area on a more permanent basis at Salida to work the Baldwin branch with 278. And although everybody knows how this engine went to the railroad fair in 1949, but did you know that in 1945, the 268 was put on a flat car? They took the turbo generator off and they dummied up a stack and a diamond stack, and it toured the Rio Grande system for the 75th anniversary of the DMRGW. That's in Salida. You can see the hotel there, the famous hotel. And so I didn't know that until this picture came to light. H.B. Parker from Nebraska took this photo. And then, of course, the most famous paint job of all, now we call it the Bumblebee paint job, although I've never seen that phrase used in the 1950s, but maybe it was, I don't know. But classic photograph of the engine in Crested Butte, right about the time that the big coal mine that you can see in the background, the big CF&I coal mine, shut down forever, and that was soon to be the death knell for the Gunnison lines. The caboose there is on display down in Lake City, and of course the locomotive in Gunnison. And it was stored in the roundhouse pending sort of the final cleanup of cars for the scrapping. Bob Lemsina caught this in 1955. You notice the bell is missing. It was stolen out of when it was in the roundhouse by, well, everybody knows who stole it, but he's worked for the railroad at the time. I saw the bell. His son had it in Gunnison. I saw the bell in the 1970s. Supposedly it still exists. When that fellow left town, it went to a club or somebody, some organization in Gunnison, but it's not on the locomotive, although there is an appropriate bell on the locomotive now on display. So what about the C19s? Well, you know, they pretty much went through the same rebuild. Here's the 340. That's, of course, now not very far. 1939, photo by Bissinger, as far as we can tell, although maybe somebody else took it and but we see the same identical appliances and layouts and cab design as the other locomotives. So they really standardized this stuff. 345 in Montrose by Laurie Brown, kind of a rail fan that lived in Vermont and came out in the early 40s and shot some interesting pictures. A couple of his have been published. And of course, this was the engine that was later used in the famous head-on collision for the Denver and Rio Grande movie. And the old style Baldwin domes of this locomotive were then donated, let's say, to the 346. Bob Richardson was able to get those off this wrecked engine and put them on the 346. So it's looking a little bit forlorn there in Montrose. That Uray branch had pretty light rails, so there were a number of light engines over there. So by 1950, we're down to just 4 locomotives, 2 C19s and 2 C60s. And preserved locomotives, however, we do have 1 grant, 2 of the C16s, and 3 of the C19s. We have to add back in the Rio Grande Southern engine. And for a total of 6 preserved out of 152. So not real good, but better than what it could. All thanks to all those rebuilds and those ICC regulations, which kept that stuff going. And the C19s are still being rebuilt and still being used. Here's the 41 taken in Durango as they finished off the work there. Major rebuild, and then a test run up on the High Line. Nice shot there by my brother-in-law, Clyde Travis, who works for them. So that's the end of the program. I'll pull up that other photographs. So I know there was some questions, people had questions about the 278 cab damage. And I do have a photograph of that if we want to. So, of course, there are a number of rumors what happened to the roof. And so I, of course, looked at it, and then I met with the Park Service guys to give them my 2 cents worth. Basically, what happened is the wood rotted. All of the wood rotted. And the wind blew a bunch of the wood off. You can see it stacked up there in the cab. And this is where we start getting into the age-old question of preservation and historical accuracy and all of that. Because what happened was that when the Park Service went to bid this out in 2010, research had shown that Baldwin Locomotive Works used the wood species ash to build their locomotive cabs in 1882. And that's actually true. A lot of companies used ash, walnut, other things. And so the Park Service bid the specs out to rebuild this cab out of ash. Unfortunately, the cab that was on there from 1916 or whenever was built out of white oak, not ash. And 10 years of weathering did that. Ash is not a weatherproof wood species, at least the type of ash you get these days. Maybe the ash trees back in the day were good. And what's interesting is that another locomotive did the same thing, 315. 315, research said, ash cab, Baldwin. So they built a brand new, beautiful ash cab, and it didn't make it 10 years. They had to rebuild that cab because it was all rotten from water getting in. And the cab was rebuilt in Chama not too many years ago. So the Park Service was bidding out a new job to build a new cab, but I don't have any status report on that. But that is what happened to the roof. It just simply rotted because of the wood species was not really the correct species for the cab, and of course the severe climate there doesn't help either. So that's all I got to tell you.
Bill, do you have time to take some questions?
Certainly.
Can we turn the lights up a little bit so we can see who's asking?
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Two questions about Bill 1915
Regulations.
Who did those inspections? Did the railroads self-certify? I don't think the ICC had any folks that did, or state agencies, inspect. I mean, how's that inspection done? And then second thing is, were there any regulations then about the wheels of the locomotives? The regulations were administered by the railroad companies. Of course, they had a lot of paperwork they had to follow. And if you read if they didn't do it properly, if they faked stuff, there were severe penalties. And it's written in, so it was a pretty severe thing. But like I said, a lot of these were sort of standard practice or best practice, but they became codified in law and we didn't follow. And certainly the inspectors would come out, there's of course you hear the anecdotes of, locomotive 20 and the RGS when the ICC was coming, they parked it out, 50 miles away somewhere where no one would see it. And then there's of course a wheel profile rules. Yeah, I have a copy of the book. You can look at it. It's got profiles drawn and all of these. I mean, the Form 4s and the daily inspection reports, the monthly inspection reports, these are printed in that book. And then you just reprinted them, put your railroad name on it, and everyone followed the same rules. That's how.
Another question?
What do you know about the C16 society that's coming together for it?
Question was about the C16 society that may or may not be coming together.
Yeah, technically I'm a member. They haven't charged me any money, but yeah, I've helped them out. They, I provided some photographs for their display at the narrow gauge convention. It's some live steam guys basically out of California. They have been working a lot with the 223 people, and then they decided to kind of create an organization to maybe help some of the other locomotives. And they did a lot of the Park Service. I got them together with the Park Service. They did help provide some information to the Park Service along as well as I. And so, yeah, it's a new organization, and it's there to try to help preserve what's left, and we'll see how it goes. So Lady Moreland is one of the board members, some of you know him, and he's been very active with the 268 with the museum folks.
Leighton wanted to be here tonight, but I think he had to work.
He had to work like, being a salary guy, he had the submission deadlines for the engineering.
Andy, can you tell if we have any questions from the members far away?
I will let them unmute themselves so they can unmute and ask if they want.
Yeah, if anybody's out on Zoom, they can unmute and they have a question.
I'll just make one comment with regard to the boiler inspections. As far as I know, those are covered by the ASC boiler. And it's just a fire tube type boiler code section addresses those. They also govern the qualification of inspectors and parts and so forth. So I think it's all there too.
Yeah, it's interesting what happened. The ICC rules covered the railroads, ASTM covered short lines, and another ICC was interstate commerce. So people like Rio Grande follow that sort of. But if you had a little mining railroad with a 04 border, it's their follow ICC. But a lot of those rules were all gotten rid of in the 1970s. The steam engines, disappeared, burning, but they got rid of those rules because railroads didn't use steam locomotives. So then the preservation people really had no guidance. Now, some railroads like Rio Grande and Silverton had, their own return. They kept up, doing what they were doing. But some tourist railroads, of course, culminating with the famous, infamous boiler explosion on that Gettysburg Railroad. And so the tourist industry, as well as the Federal Railroad Administration, came back together. They actually got with the ASTM And they got all these rules and they looked at how locomotives were being done. And in 2002, they came out with this revised boiler recommendations from this committee, which, you know, people like the Grande and others, you know, the Strasbourg, all the really top steam guys in the US, they all had their input. And a lot of it is just bringing back the old ICC. And I know that just a few years ago, the ASTM, the Boiler Inspection Society, you know, National Board.
Well, they're one of 4 or 5 ASTM,
Yeah.
American Society for Testing of Materials. So the ASME is American Society of Mechanical Engineers.
Yeah.
I'm a member. I can go research that and find out.
Well, it's been all brought back in. If you go buy a copy of the Boiler Inspection Code, National Board Codes, the locomotive stuff is back in the code. That's
Well,
what-
my point is it never left. There's 17 volumes. It's never been canceled, if you will. It's always been. So that's my understanding. I'll go research. I'll report
Yeah,
back.
I'm not sure of course, what happened.
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate it. I'm just mentioning it because as far as I know, everybody's always had to follow the code. The code is the law. It is the ASME code that was certified by the state agencies to follow. And that's why it's called the code. But in any event, I'll research it and bring it back.
Yeah, I'm sure everybody would like to see them.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Seems that I only recall a couple of photos of engines with the main driver being the third driving axle and the rest of them involved the second. And that seems like that was pretty much the practice on these older, smaller, narrow gauge engines. Of course, all the K series, they all have the main connected to the third axle. Do you know the details of why they went which way?
The question was whether there was any rhyme or reason to why the second or the third driver was made.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the engineering of that. Of course, these locomotives, these 3 classes were all pretty standard, pretty identical designs, but I'm not familiar with some of the alternatives.
Have you seen anything on the internet that anybody wants to know something?
Got something from Andrew Ladowski, but he already signed up, but he just said, were the K series replacing the C's or did they just need fewer locos?
Question was, did the K series replace the C's or did they just not need it?
I think it would be fair to say they replaced them.
They're a lot more attractive effort, right?
Yeah, bigger locomotives.
And newer.
You know, when you really look at by the 1930s, the only C classes left were because of the very, very light Black Canyon line. Could not take a K class locomotive. It was too heavy, even for a mud hammer. It was too heavy. And of course, there were some oddball classes like the 3 engines from the Crystal River Railroad. Those were typically the ones that ran down through Black Canyon, for example, Zero Summit. So these little engines, you know, from a business standpoint, they survived because of the need to haul traffic on light rails. So we kind of looked at the mechanical side of what did they do to keep these things.
All right. If we don't have any other questions for Bill, I have a couple things. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
Bill, you stuck around for a couple more days because I put you over to my that was interesting that, you know, we talked about the 41 getting rebuilt down at Durango, and I wouldn't be surprised if the 340 might make a visit out to, I don't know if that's up for public knowledge, but it's a strong room. They come from the West Coast and get some TLC there in Durango. Also, I think we talked about the Union Pacific Big Boy will go on tour sometime this year. They're calling it the Four Corners Tour, meaning the 4 corners of the Union Pacific system, but they have not yet announced any dates that I'm aware of. Thanks for coming out tonight, everybody. I know we kind of got scared by the weather, but luckily that held off a day. It's good to see a pretty good sized crowd here, and the chair rack is in the back. If you guys would hang them up, that'd be great. And, like I said, next month we have 40 years later on the Cougars and Toltec from Earl New. He'll do that via internet. So thanks for coming out.